most Jews may not know this history, so they have this fantasy, this delusion about Israel, but I can't understand today how that's possible, because the realities are that this is a horrible racist endeavor. Now, by the way, it's interesting, when I use that word, the definition of anti-Semitism says that to call Zionism or Israel a racist endeavor is an example of anti-Semitism. No, it's a simple fact. It's a simple objective description of the Zionist project. It's not even controversial.
Salamat everyone. You are listening to Red Inverted Triangle. This show is about the ongoing struggle for liberation in Palestine, produced on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Like Palestine, Australia is a ground zero of a genocide that has been occurring for over 200 years and continues to this day. From the river to the sea, this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Ahmed. I am a Palestinian living on this stolen land, and I'll be your host. This podcast aims to provide the Palestinian story, the Palestinian narrative. It's necessary because we live in a heavily indoctrinated society where, as Palestinians, being able to speak, to tell our stories and narrate is the ultimate form of resistance. That's right. Resistance, hence the name of our show, Red Inverted Triangle. Each week, we'll be bringing you different segments, such as news updates from Palestine, Palestinian music, interviews with Palestinian figures or non-Palestinian figures talking about Palestine, and everything else related to Palestine. Thanks for tuning in, and long live the resistance. This episode of Red Inverted Triangle, we are bringing you a conversation I've had with Peter Slezak. Peter Slezak is an honorary associate professor of philosophy at the University of New South Wales, Australia, a Jewish anti-Zionist and public commentator on science, philosophy, religion and politics. Author of The Spectator in the Cartesian Theatre. I hope you'll find my conversation with Peter useful and productive. Enjoy. Professor Peter, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Ahmed. I'm very pleased to be here. Ramadan Kareem to you.
Ramadan Kareem to you too. Before we start, Peter, there is a witch hunt happening in Australia. You know, some compare the current atmosphere to the 1950s McCarthyism in the US. So I mentioned the new definition of anti-Semitism that was endorsed by Universities Australia. But before I get your reaction on this definition, which was criticized by many organizations internally, the likes of Amnesty International in Australia, for example, it referred to it as a contested or as an attempt to stifle freedom of expression across campuses nationwide. So before we delve into the details of that question and its repercussions, I want to lay the ground for our conversation today by asking you this. It's probably going to sound like a provocative question, but has there been a tangible rise in anti-Semitism in Australia? And if there is a tangible rise in anti-Semitism, what motivates it? What feeds it? What are the main sources of that anti-Semitism? If you could also expand on the history of anti-Semitism, it's relevant because one can't help but asking the question, why now? Why is there all this mobilization in our legal and social and academic systems around the concept of anti-Semitism that we actually need to define it? So I know there's a lot of questions out there, but is there, because when you go out there and say, no, there's no anti-Semitism, it's not rife, it's not on the rise, it's all a joke or something. So you get criticized heavily in the community. What are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, it's the right question to ask. Look, just let me begin by saying I got criticized in a speech I gave to the Gaza rally for sounding like I was downplaying the extent of it or denying its existence. I can't do that. Look, it's an empirical question, but it's muddied because the organizations like the Executive Council of Australian Jewry and others who keep a track of anti-Semitism, they don't distinguish what you might call real Jew hatred from criticism of Israel. They deliberately conflate those. And so one has to be careful to separate those out. And I can't deny that there's some real anti-Semitism out there. But the interesting thing and the question that has to be asked is, why, if it did, why did it explode on October the 7th? In America, Mearsheimer, the political analyst, made the same point. He said, and so does Norman Finkelstein, by the way, in a very good speech, when he was pressed on the extent of anti-Semitism, it's not that you can deny it because there are extreme right-wing, groups that are obviously anti-Semitic, but one has to put this in context. I think the hysterical outcry about it now is totally disproportionate to any real extent to which there's anti-Semitism, as we now know. But even before we discovered that the examples in Australia, they're all fake, even before we knew that, although it was pretty suspicious. I mean, it was stupid. They couldn't spell Israel properly when they did their graffiti. And it was very suspicious even before it now became exposed publicly. The reality in Australia was that, as I said, the extent of anti-Semitism has been negligible. It's not irrelevant that, in my experience, there's been zero anti-Semitism in my whole life in Australia. Zero. And so, and Mearsheimer made the same point, and so does Norman Finkelstein. One has to put this in context. I think the overblown overreaction to this has to be understood as completely unwarranted. And it's not to deny that there is some anti-Semitism out there. But the other thing to say, somebody online made a very good point. Criticism of Jews who support the crimes of the state of Israel, who support a genocide, is not anti-Semitism. One has to be very clear about this. Criticizing a group that explicitly advocate and support the state of Israel as Jews, as the leadership does, it's not anti-Semitism to criticize them because they, as a group, identify themselves as a Jewish organization or Jewish leadership, and they're supporting crimes, atrocities, genocide. To call that anti-Semitism is really inappropriate. It's certainly a group of people that deserves to be criticized. It's very hard to walk this line carefully because inevitably you are talking about Jews as Jews. But look, there's a slogan which I want to spell out quickly. Many of us Jews will say, for example, the slogan, "Not in our name," and they'll also say, "Silence is complicity." But if you spell that out, what does it mean to say "not in our name"? It means those of us who are opposed to this as Jews repudiate the crimes that are being committed on our behalf. But it implies, what about the rest of the Jews who are not saying that, who are not publicly disavowing and dissociating themselves? They're, I think, justly criticized. It's not for being Jews, it's for not repudiating. They're placed in a difficult position. I've thought about this a lot, how to say this carefully. I think the Jews are put in an awkward position. When Israel claims to be a Jewish state, it is committing not only a genocide, but has an apartheid system discriminating on behalf of Jews, and Jews all around the world have rights that the Palestinians who are refugees don't have. This is being committed on behalf of Jews. So Jews are placed in an awkward moral position. You can't just ignore it and be silent about it. You kind of are forced to take a stand. It seems to me that there's no choice. Israel and the Jewish organizations here who are so loudly supporting the atrocities and the crimes, in a way, ordinary Jews can't just be quiet about it. So this is a difficulty to get exactly clear on what is the moral responsibility. And I don't think sitting on the fence is an option. So I think that's the difficulty, how to state this properly. But it's not anti-Semitic to point to Jews. Look, let me give you an example. I grew up with my parents. It's relevant to mention here in case people don't know. My parents were Holocaust survivors. I mean, my mother was in Auschwitz and my grandmother, they both survived Auschwitz. My father was in other concentration camps. I grew up in this whole community. Most of my parents' friends were Holocaust survivors. But one of the interesting things was, maybe justly or unjustly, we all had a very critical opinion of Germans. There was, I mean, they wouldn't buy, German cars. There was this boycott of anything German. I mean, you could understand why one rightly was critical of the Germans. There was a book published not that long ago, which is not a very good book, but it used the title Hitler's Willing Executioners to refer to Germans. Now, it's not fair of all Germans. There were some admirable Germans, but there was a sense in which the Jews use a phrase, the righteous among the nations. This is a phrase that Jews use, and they celebrate it in the Yad Vashem memorial in Israel for those Germans that stood up, at great cost, by the way, after 1933, to speak out was dangerous and very risky. So the question today is, why don't more Jews speak up and disown and dissociate themselves from the now extraordinary, extreme horrors of what Israel is committing in our name? So to walk that line carefully is difficult, but I think one has to recognize that Jews have a responsibility now, and one can't avoid that.
But I do want to ask you this question. Why don't the larger, wider Jewish community come out in criticizing the state of Israel and the genocide and be more spoken out?
It's a very good question. There are a number of reasons for it. One of the main reasons, I read the Jewish press. I mean, I read it, and I'm horrified. I don't think I'm overstating it to say that they are wallowing in October the 7th and the crimes and the attack by Hamas, which was pretty terrible. Of course, Israel was responsible for a large number of the deaths. But the Jewish press in Australia and in America and elsewhere are not paying attention to what happened in Gaza since. This is a horrible reflection on Jewish thinking. They are using language about the tragic case of the young kid in detention there, one of the hostages inside Gaza. They're obsessed with justifiable tragedy in one case and ignoring a genocide. Now, the psychology of this is very difficult to understand because they're not paying attention to the immense tragedy of the Palestinians in Gaza. I'm horrified by this because I can't quite understand it. They must see some of it, but the Jewish press is ignoring it. Gideon Levy in Israel will say that Israeli television doesn't show pictures of Gaza. So somehow, and look, I talked to some Jews who are not only ignoring it, but actually downplaying it, or to use the vernacular, they don't give a shit. Now, that's a reality which is very disturbing, and if you don't mix in the Jewish community, you don't see it. Most of my Palestinian friends don't know how serious this denial is, and it's a reflection of the difficulty we face. So your question is a very good one. The polarization since October 7, it was bad enough before. I mean, I've tried over the years to argue and debate the Palestine problem with Jewish friends. It was hard enough. After October 7, it's become completely impossible. And it's because they're wallowing in their own, they're obsessed with their own particular perspective on this whole thing.
It's almost that they can't see through this veil that is clouding their brain. And this is my next question, actually. I spoke with Professor Haim Rashid Zabner the other day about the Israeli society and how they see the genocide. And, more than 96% of the society, they actually agree that this is enough force or not enough force against Gaza. So does it also go to the level of indoctrination in the West as well? And, this perception of Israel, especially at the Jewish community, like they were born and raised having Israel as, like Naomi Klein mentioned, as this idol that they're worshipping throughout their life. Does it boil down to that kind of understanding as well?
Yeah, but one has to distinguish Australia, I think, from America. Norman Finkelstein some years ago wrote a book titled something like They Know Too Much. American Jews are different from Australian Jews. Most Australian Jews of my age had parents that were refugees from the Holocaust, a very large proportion. And in America, the Jews have a much longer history. They came out in, I guess, the 1800s, and they were on the left, and they were at the forefront of the civil rights movements, and they're in the professions, and they have a different complexion completely. And most of them are Democrat voters. In Australia, I think most Jews would be liberal voters here. They'd be conservative. The Jewish community in America is very different. They're in academia, in the law. They have an intellectual depth and sophistication. And I think that's different from Australia. So Finkelstein was pointing out that they're having trouble reconciling their progressive values with what they're starting to know about the history and the present crimes of the State of Israel. In Australia, I see much less evidence of the Jewish community struggling with that attempt to reconcile the realities of the State of Israel with their values, because I don't think they have progressive values as much as the American Jews do. That's an important difference. But in America, I mean, the Jewish Voice is for Peace, and a lot of Jews are standing up for Palestine. That's a significant development in America. Here we've got, fortunately, the Jewish Council of Australia and others that are having a significant impact. That's a very important development, but it's not enough. So yes, that's the difficulty. That the mainstream, if you read the mainstream Jewish press, it's horrifying. I mean, I just saw an article this afternoon which is going on about biblical, Amalek, this whole stuff about Jews are still victims of anti-Semitism. They're always the victims. This is disgraceful.
Going through history, I mean, the reason why Zionism was established is to actually combat anti-Semitism. So I want to talk about Zionism and the Zionist lobby here in Australia. How useful has the Zionist lobby been in Australia to kind of combat or influence anti-Semitism in Australia? Is it helping?
It's making it worse. I mean, the Zionist lobby. I mean, I just posted a nice interview or a speech by the American woman, Katie Halpert.
Yes.
And I think it's not too strong to say, as she said, the Zionists and the Jews are, in fact, creating anti-Semitism by their behavior. Look, the Zionist project is a terrible crime from the beginning. And I didn't know this. I mean, most of us perhaps didn't know this growing up, but the history of it is very shocking. I can tell you an interesting personal connection to this. My mother's first cousin, I grew up with a kind of uncle here, my closest family. He was the federal head of the JNF in Australia. The JNF is the Jewish National Fund. And their responsibility is this quasi-governmental organization. Their responsibility is the expropriation of Palestinian land. And he was their representative in Australia for 40 years. I've got a picture of him with Ben Gurion. Well, the JNF is responsible for stealing Palestinian land, not allowing Palestinians to return. So Zionism, the history of Zionism is actually very shocking. It goes back, of course, to the Balfour Declaration, where it was explicitly to expropriate the Palestinian land. The more you read about the history, the worse it is. I mean, so Zionism is not a benign project of coexistence. And in fact, the early founders of Zionism were very much more honest about it. I mean, Ben Gurion and others were very clear that they have to expel the Palestinians. They said so explicitly. Nowadays, it's not polite to talk that way. But the earlier founders, people like Jabotinsky, for example, they were very clear, very open. Now, most Jews may not know this history, so they have this fantasy, this delusion about Israel. But I can't understand today how that's possible, because the realities are that this is a horrible racist endeavor. Now, by the way, it's interesting when I use that word. The definition of anti-Semitism says that to call Zionism or Israel a racist endeavor is an example of anti-Semitism. No, it's a simple fact. It's a simple objective description of the Zionist project. It's not even controversial. So this is what we're up against. You know, a lot of those definitions are simply stating things that are uncontroversial facts. And now Palestinians are having to defend themselves for being anti-Semitic, for simply reflecting the objective truth about the whole history.
I remember reading about Edmund Samuel Montagu. He was, part of the anti-Zionist Jewish leadership, and he was the only figure in the British cabinet back in the early 20th century. And he actually described Zionism with worse terms than this. He called it as mischievous creed. It'll prove as a rallying ground for anti-Semites and anti-Semitism in every single country. So the early Jewish community knew what Zionism is and what it's going to do.
Well, Edwin Montagu knew. I mean, but Chaim Weizmann, who was running the show with the support of the British elites, and in fact, the Balfour Declaration was drafted by Chaim Weizmann and with the American jurist Brandeis. They cooked this up, and it was a deceitful document. They talked about a Jewish home. They meant a state. It was already planned to make a state to displace the Palestinians way back in 1917. So yes, but you're right. There's a wonderful story to be told there. I want to make a movie about it. I mean, Montagu was the only decent Jew. He wrote a very powerful letter that you're referring to, which was so clear. And today it's very telling, because he said then exactly what has to be said about what a disgraceful project the whole idea was. He and Curzon in the British cabinet were the only two, I think, that spoke forcefully and truly about what we see now. And in retrospect, they were so prescient about what was in store.
Absolutely. And that story that you're referring to, I really encourage everyone to look it up. It's an incredible story. It's a love story, actually, a romantic story. And some say, actually, if it wasn't for that story, Zionism would probably have not made it through. But that's probably for another webinar. So I want to talk more about this new definition. What are the main concerns of these definitions? I mean, and also, how does it compare to the IHRA definition that we mentioned that is also deeply controversial? And more importantly, how would such a definition impact on the academic freedom in Australia and on pro-Palestine movement? Like, we've seen what's happening in the US, the arresting by, ICE of this Palestinian activist, Mahmoud Khalil. We're seeing a lot of legislations being written here in Australia off the back of this hoax operation, if you want to call it. So how does this new definition, if it's adopted at universities and campuses, how is that going to affect our freedom of academic freedom?
Look, I haven't got it in front of me here, but the first thing to say is that it's a watered-down version of the IHRA. And in fact, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, they just had a big seminar about anti-Semitism, and they're unhappy that it got watered down. They are still pushing the IHRA, and this watered-down version, which the universities have accepted, still has very strong and problematic features. The original IHRA gave, the definition itself was kind of waffly and vague and not very helpful at all, but it was always accompanied with 11 examples of anti-Semitism. It was always tied to those examples, and the history of it's important because more than half of the examples, 6 or 7 out of the 11, were actually about Israel. And one of them said, for example, as I think I mentioned, Israel to say Israel is a racist endeavor is anti-Semitic. Well, no. I mean, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, even B'Tselem, any number of organizations now come out documenting the extent to which it's an apartheid system. And actually, in the West Bank, it's worse than apartheid, and in Gaza, it's a genocide. So it has a number of features, the original definition, more than half of which were actually trying to build a criticism of Israel into the definition of anti-Semitism. Now, there's a long history of this. I wrote a piece which I was able to give to some of our federal government ministers. It was ignored. But the history of it is important because an enormous number of people came out criticizing the IHRA for the obvious reasons. The barrister Geoffrey Robertson and various other people wrote strong. In fact, the originator of it, the author, whatever his name is, I can't remember.
Stern, yes.
Stern, that's right. He repudiated the definition, saying it weaponizes anti-Semitism against Palestinians.
And he is not anti-Zionist. He's a Zionist, actually.
No, he was part of the... So that's important. In fact, the other thing that's important to say is about 200 Jewish experts on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust came out with an alternative. I mean, you shouldn't need a definition. To the credit of a few universities, they recognize that racism is racism, whether it's against Buddhists or Muslims or Jews or anybody. You shouldn't need a special definition for Jews. Politically, unfortunately, it's become kind of unavoidable because people want to show their, virtue signaling to show that they're against anti-Semitism. So somehow it's hard to avoid that. But in fact, so they came up with this Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, which people like Peter Beinart and various other people, many Jews, and after all, 200 experts on anti-Semitism have drafted this thing. And it, of course, drops any mention of Israel. If you're going to define anti-Semitism, it's Jew hatred, and there's a number of ways you could define it. It's got nothing to do with a political entity and whatever it does and whatever it stands for. So, unfortunately, the JDA hasn't had the kind of uptake and attraction that I would have thought would be important and helpful. That's a whole other debate. It's been rejected by many people, but maybe still important to revisit, because if we have to fight back. Look what's happened since the original IHRA was drafted. It's only become even more powerful as a weapon, and as they say, weaponized against Palestinians. And it would help if we had some way to push back against that. So in a way, that confirmed that the alternative, the JDA, might have been a useful way to push back against that. So the new definition that the universities have adopted are a watered-down version of that, and everything's always qualified to sort of get them off the hook. And I can't remember exactly the particulars. You may have it in front of you there. But actually, a very good response to it was written by the Jewish Council. They got a very strong and very powerful response to it. And it's really unacceptable because it is weaponizing a criticism of Israel and really hosing down critical speech and academic freedom and all the values that we should have at a university. So this is problematic. And now, I don't know, all the universities in Australia have adopted this.
Yes, I mean, now it's left to the different universities how they want to adopt it, how they want to implement it on their campuses. So it'll be interesting to see how that will feature in the future. And I kind of agree with you on terms of the Jerusalem definition of anti-Semitism. I mean, being an alternative, it has absolutely no mention of criticizing Israel. And when you talk about Zionism, equating Zionism with Judaism, that's what the current definition seeks to do. It's absolutely absurd, because talking about a religion, more than 50,000 years old religion with a less than 100 years old political ideology.
And two things I'd say about that. One is that the definition tries to fudge it by saying that, well, of course, talking about Zionism isn't always anti-Semitic, but it might be or could be. and they're sneaking it in that way. So it's really inappropriate to refer to Zionism as even possibly anti-Semitic. I mean, you could find anti-Semitism anywhere. You could say anything and it might be anti-Semitic. This is ridiculous. The other thing I wanted to say relevant to this is the attempt to identify anti-Semitism with Palestinian dissent and resistance is really inappropriate if you confront the number of Jews in the world that are anti-Zionist Jews. And in America, unlike here, there are hundreds of thousands of Orthodox committed Jews. They call themselves true Torah Jews. I mean, most Jews in Israel are atheists and agnostics. So the idea that you can somehow show that it's anti-Semitic to be supporting the Palestinians because, if you're a real Jew, then you support Israel, it's just refuted by the fact that you've got hundreds of thousands of really ultra-Orthodox Jews that are repudiating and anti-Zionist. That's a very important thing. It doesn't get as much attention as it deserves because it doesn't help the Zionists to show that if you're a real Jew, in their terms, I mean, they take literally a lot of the fundamental aspects of Judaism and their scriptures.
100%. And that's the deviousness of Zionism. It kind of hijacks the entire religion. My question to you about your speech at the rally. It sounded a little bit confusing, and I'm hoping that you can add a little bit of elaboration on a certain point. So you spoke at a recent rally and actually had that speech also posted on Pearls and Irritation. It's a powerful one because I was there at the rally. The speech and article, as you mentioned earlier today in our conversation, provoked some kind of criticism, benign criticism or criticism nonetheless, mostly around the use of language. Language implying that the behavior of the Jewish community might warrant very negative ideas about them and hence, intensify anti-Semitism. So this is you blaming the community that's how it could be perceived. Behavior like their support of Israel and its conduct against the Palestinians. So could you elaborate a little bit on that comment, and why do you think your speech created such criticism?
Well, look, in some quarters among lefty Jews who are broadly supportive, I have got criticism, and I have to concede that I wasn't perhaps subtle or nuanced enough in some of the things I said. It may have sounded like, and maybe my words encourage interpreting that I was denying that there's any anti-Semitism anywhere. But that's certainly not true, and I can't defend that, and I wouldn't have wanted to say that. I didn't intend to say that. My words weren't intended to deny any anti-Semitism, but I wanted to put it in context. I would have said that anti-Semitism in Australia has been negligible in my entire life here, and probably still, and that now includes all this fake stuff. So I wanted to put it in context. So it's not to deny that there's in some quarters, but it's not to be taken seriously. And certainly it's not to be weaponized to silence support for Israel. In fact, one of the things that I do want to say, and I said it in my speech, and I wish I could have quoted more, one of the things that I think is very important for us is following people like my colleague Lana Tartour and the wonderful Randa Abdel Fattah. We have to listen to the Palestinian voices, and they are very articulate about their view and how they're in favor of coexistence with the Jews in Israel. There's nothing anti-Semitic in anything they say, on the contrary, and their voices have to be brought to the fore, and Jews have a responsibility to do that. Interestingly, in one of the criticisms I've got that was focusing on my exact words, which were open to perhaps not being explicit or subtle enough, they ignored my emphasis on the Palestinian voices that we have to listen to, because that's the way to refute the claims of anti-Semitism when it's clear that the Palestinian movement, I mean, there is zero anti-Semitism at the rallies. I've been to every rally for over a year. They, to their credit, get up and say, this is not about Jews, it's about Israel. You couldn't be more open and explicit. And these leaders like the Palestinian spokesman, Nasser Mashni, the president of AIPAC, they're perfectly open about this. This is ignored, but it's very important to bring their voices out to refute the suggestion that there's anti-Semitism. So, okay, there's probably anti-Semitism out there somewhere. The Palestinians are not to blame for it, because there just isn't any. But it's not fair to focus on it and to create this hysteria about it, as has been done. And I'm very angry about that. I think it's disgraceful, and it's actually really kind of offensive to be emphasizing anti-Semitism when, after all, the problem is a genocide. And now your question was about the extent to which Jews are responsible. Well, again, I have to say that Randa Abdel Fattah is very explicit and clear about this. Jews can't evade a certain responsibility for this. I'm going to read a quote of hers, if I may. I've got a bunch of them here. Firstly, she says, since when do the victims of the genocide have the responsibility to defer and to protect the feelings of those who enact and support and enable their genocide? This is, of course, the Jewish community. And she says again, how can any individual support an apartheid settler colonial state which carpet bombs and starves a population of over 2 million people and still make it about your sense of safety or the alleged concerns that they have? Forgive me for continuing because I'm very impressed and I can't say it any more eloquently than Randa has said it. And she says, given the hysteria about kefirs and slogans and the rallies, she says the feelings and fragility of Zionists are used as a rhetorical shield to deflect from engaging with the moral and material reality of the genocide. I think that's the important point, that we are diverted from this horror for which the Jews bear a responsibility. That's part of your question. The Jews can't evade the fact that this is being done in their name, and they have a responsibility. So there's a number of other quotes which I wish I could go through, but to give you the sense that we're being diverted. And I didn't know you were going to quote Abba Eban, Chomsky's. I always quote him too. That goes back way back, and that's why I quote Shulamit Aloni. It's the trick that is always used. Well, now we've seen this, escalated to a degree. It's a diversion from the atrocities which Jews bear a responsibility for. There's no way to say it any other way.
It goes way, way, way back. It's a trick that all the Zionists use to smear any critic of them as anti-Semitic. And, talking about anti-Semitism and the pro-Palestine movement, I want to also kind of paraphrase what Rafat Larir, the poet who was murdered in Gaza last year.
I met him I got to meet him in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia.
Such an incredible character. And he was quoted to say, I'm paraphrasing here, that we should not apologize for anti-Semitism because we have as a pro-Palestine, as Palestinians, we have an umbrella understanding that there's absolutely no intent for us to kind of fight against or criticize Jews for being Jews. And I probably would want to quote Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas. He once in an interview said, if an Arab country comes to Palestine and does what the Jewish people are doing to us right now, guess what? We're going to be fighting them exactly the same way. So it's never about the Jewish people for being Jews. It's about the colonization, the settler colonial project, and the Zionism as a settler colonial ideology. So did Zionism originally intend to take over all of Palestine?
One word answer, yes. I mean, that's why I mentioned the Balfour Declaration. As I said, the declaration itself fudges. It talks about a home for the Jewish people. But you can read any number of places where Balfour was clear and Weizmann was clear in speeches he gave. If you read the history of this, which is very well worth reading, they were very clear. In fact, they started to interfere with the British mandate authorities there. They started to take over running the place. They were really pissing off the British. They had their agency or what it was called, starting to set up the social infrastructure. So yes, I mean, from the beginning, and then of course they were bringing in huge numbers, were increasingly being brought in. The British were trying to stop it to some extent, but the British were helping the Zionists. So it's not a nice story. It's a very ugly story. And you mentioned rightly, that's why the answer to it, you just have to read Edwin Montagu's response to the Balfour Declaration. It's so clear what the intention was. And as I say, they didn't hide it. Even Chaim Weizmann in his speeches, it was absolutely explicit. And they had this disdain for the Palestinians. I mean, the Balfour Declaration doesn't mention Arabs or Palestinians. It uses the phrase, the non-Jewish population. It was already this racist document. And of course, Balfour was paradoxically an anti-Semite as well as a racist in other respects. So it's a very ugly story. That's something that Jews have to confront because they've been told a lot of bullshit their whole life. It's relevant to mention here that when I was young, there was a movie based on a book by Leon Uris called Exodus. The younger people won't know this, but there was the theme song was a hit on the hit parade, and it starred Paul Newman, this beautiful young man, and it was about the refugees coming from the Holocaust. And I have to mention, of course, my uncle in Israel had the tattoo on his arm, and he told me that he came from Auschwitz. He arrived I asked him in an interview, it's on tape, I asked him, when did he arrive in Israel? He said, on the day that the State of Israel was proclaimed. That was the 14th of May, 1948. And that film is about the refugees in the refugee boat coming out. And it doesn't mention Palestinians. It's like, the mythology of being a land for a people without a land and, all that stuff, as if there were no people there. This is what we all grew up with. That's why Ilan Pappé and even Benny Morris and Avi Schleim and the historians, it's relatively recently they started to tell us that the entire story of Zionism has been a lie. Jews have a lot of trouble swallowing this. It's actually a shock. It turns out it's an atrocity and a crime that has been perpetrated on the Palestinians, and Jews have to confront this. It's tough.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Peter. So are these IHRA and UA definitions legally binding or enforceable?
No, they're not legal. That, in a way, they're not, but they've become very influential. That's the trouble. Governments have adopted them. When the IHRA thing came out, and I was involved in writing letters, as I said, to universities and trying to present a document to the federal government, Albanese came out and endorsed the IHRA definition, the original, the terrible one. And to this day, he's supportive of that. And governments around the world, you can check the records. It's been enormously contagious. It's had an enormous impact. And as I say now, a watered-down version of it is now being swallowed by universities. It's been very, very harmful. And but it's not legally binding, yet. But it, in a way, it doesn't matter because they're acting and introducing legislations, as we see here currently, this rapid reflex to move to legislation because of the so-called anti-Semitism. People are pointing out that they should repeal all this stuff now. There wasn't any. That none of this graffiti and bomb hoaxes have any basis. So this knee-jerk attempt to legislate against it was all without foundation. So even if it's not currently binding in legislation, it's having a very, very harmful effect.
To my understanding, Peter, and correct me if I'm wrong, so there are a number of references that universities usually rely on in defining, for example, racism against the Jewish population. And they recently endorsed this document to be added to the pool of references that they can later rely on or extract the definition that they want to implement. Is that how it's perceived, as in at least within the academic system, that this is a document that has been added to the pool of references?
Look, I don't know what the status of it is when a university endorses this 39 universities have endorsed it, whatever that means, but it gives them some authority or some claim that they can impose it as part of their policies. And as you see now in America, which is much worse, that case that you mentioned, the government, but the universities too, Harvard and a number of universities were starting to take action. The encampments, for example, were being attacked here too. In fact, the group that ran that anti-Semitism workshop, Sky News workshop on anti-Semitism, they've got this list of 15 draconian provisions or rules, and one of them is to clamp down on student encampments, and it's this totalitarian reaction to this entirely mythical wave of anti-Semitism, which doesn't exist. So the Executive Council Australian Jury have been promoting a list of 15 really the most totalitarian rules that you could imagine. I can pull it up here and read some of them if you want. It's just shocking. They want, for example, to limit academic freedom. One of the provisions says that people should be penalised for things that they say at university in a way that's not currently possible, because we have what's left of academic freedom and tenure. It's not that easy. It's a bit complicated story. We've basically abandoned tenure in Australia, which was the protection for academic freedom. In America, it's still sacrosanct. Here we gave that away, which is another story. But even so, the idea of academic freedom is still understood to be an important value. Well, they want to undermine it by finding ways to penalise academics for saying things that these Jews happen not to like very much. This is very serious. And I hope the government, although not too much hope, that they will resist this.
But let's talk about the examples of consequences of implementing this definition. You're an academic as well at UNSW. What would the implementation of such a definition look like? If you criticize Israel or if you criticize Zionism and so on and so on, what would you be subjected to as an academic or as a student, for example?
Well, disciplinary proceedings of various sorts that are available to universities. In some cases over the years, I'm aware of some cases where one Palestinian academic was carpeted by their vice chancellor. I was called in to my dean when I made a speech to the students not that long ago. Actually, I quoted Randa Abdel Fattah, and somebody must have complained, and the dean called me in to reproach me. She ended up saying that there was no action to be taken, but I had said, I can tell you what I said. I said, Jews need to be made uncomfortable. I mean, this was regarded as somehow shocking, and predictably somebody complained. Well, I mean, I think that is right. You've heard me say things like that, and Randa is absolutely correct about that. So the universities, even if they don't act, they're creating a chilling effect on academics who now have to be careful about what they say. And there's this sense of this big brother watching, and it's chilling what ought to be the free expression of criticism of Israel as a political matter. It's clear that the atmosphere is now increasingly making this difficult. And as I say, tenure in Australia doesn't exist anymore, so people are not even protected.
Absolutely. It's dangerous times we're moving into right now. Is there a danger that the word anti-Semitism has lost a lot of its sting because it's being overused by Zionists? Yeah. Doesn't it dilute the very real claims by Jews who experience true, racism and anti-Semitism?
Yeah, of course. That's exactly right. I mean, as one of the posts I mentioned said, look, Jew hatred exists, but it can't be simply identified with what Jewish people might be supporting when they're supporting Israel. That's, as I said before, that's not Jew hatred. That's hating people that are doing shitty things. I mean, and this, it's sort of justified. It's got nothing to do with their Jewishness. As you said, if they're Buddhists or anything and they're involved in a genocide, you're not hating them because they're Jews. You're hating them because they're committing a genocide. So we have to be very clear about that. It may be a bit hard for some people's brains to separate out the Jewishness from the political programs that they're supporting. So, okay, take the Australian organisations. What attitude should we have to the Jewish Board of Deputies, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, the Australian Israel Jewish Affairs Committee? They're all Jewish organisations, and they're uncritical supporters of the genocide. Well, okay. I mean, this creates a kind of a problem, and they hide behind the anti-Semitism, as I read from Randa and others who are very clear. They use this as a shield to protect themselves, and they deserve to be criticised. There's just no way around it. I mean, what are we supposed to do? And to the credit of, I keep mentioning Randa and others who are very clear about this, because they're the victims of this, and they see it more clearly than anybody. And my point is, I keep mentioning them because I take it as a serious responsibility for Jews to understand the Palestinians. The Palestinians are grieving and traumatized. And here we are worrying about definitions of anti-Semitism. It's just shocking. It's really a scandal, and it's an obscenity. Let me put it as strongly as I can. This whole discussion that we're having, we have to have it. I understand why we're having it. But the whole diversion to worrying about what's anti-Semitism is not, what's not, it's an obscenity when our real concern as Jews ought to be what we bear some responsibility for and what Israel is doing in our name.
A father from Gaza once told me that, he's got 2 small kids, and he said, I don't want my kids to grow up hating Jews, but what do I do if the only Jew that they knew is one holding the gun in their face?
And you know what? That's a nice answer. And you know what? Contrary to the Jews that criticize me, like recently, for saying anything, I think I'm doing a favor to Jews. Me and the anti-Zionist Jews are doing the other Jews a favor, because we, and I'm not just talking about myself, of course, I'm talking about Norman Finkelstein and the Jewish Council of Australia and others. As much as they're getting hate from the Zionists, they ought to wake up to the fact that we're the proof that anti-Semitism is unwarranted, because there are Jews here and, as I mentioned, in America and elsewhere that are standing up for Palestinian justice. And so we're helping to refute the idea that anti-Semitism has any basis.
I couldn't agree more. And it's a tough task. And it's very courageous of those anti-Zionist Jewish communities to come out against this flood and storm of Zionism.
Can I just jump in and answer that too? Look, people say that, but look, in Australia, this is not Nazi Germany. If you were an anti-Nazi, you got the Gestapo shoot your brains out. I reject the idea that it's brave. Okay, so you get some rude remarks, you get some abuse, but we're talking about a genocide. How bad does it get before you stand up and speak out? The idea that it takes courage, my question is the opposite. What is the matter with the rest of the Jewish community who don't stand up when there's no real cost? Okay, so people will be rude to you. I mean, what are we talking about here? This is not Nazi Germany. That's, in a way, the other way around. It doesn't take any courage to firstly speak the truth And secondly, to stand up for what are uncontroversially atrocities on a large scale. So that's the paradox. It doesn't take any courage. That's the real interesting insight into the psychology of people who, for whatever reason, haven't got the decency. Okay, so, a couple of friends will be rude to you. I mean, look, I'm maybe overstating it. I know friends where in the family, their family would be upset with them. I get it. But, this is, how bad does it get? Are Jews waiting for 6 million before they realize that maybe this is something that their history requires for them to stand up for? It's very paradoxical that our history, and Katie Halper I mentioned before, she's very articulate about this. You think Jews above all would understand, and to use that phrase, never again. That means never again to anybody. I have to repeat that. I mean, that's what we should have learnt. Sadly, most Jews don't see it like that. They only see it about themselves.
Well said. I couldn't agree more. It's important to inject this kind of sobering sensibility to this question. So Ilan Pappé, in his book Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of Atlantic in 2024, mentions the self-doubt he detects in many Zionists, which he says spurs on to extremes their defense of a state which can only survive by constant aggression towards and domination of an other. Is this social psychology at work in our Zionist community here?
I've got his new book on my shelf, but I haven't got around to reading it yet. But from what I've heard, what I've said, what's self-doubt? Read the Jewish press. It's embarrassing that there's no self-doubt. I mean, in conversations with people, look, I'm sorry to be so, exposing the awfulness of attitudes in the Jewish community. But that's just the reality. And frankly, I think we need to face that more seriously. We need to engage somehow with the Jewish community because there's not a lot of engagement. Those of us involved on the Palestinian side, we're having rallies and we have meetings and there's all this stuff, but we're mostly talking to the converted. And the question of whether there's any self-doubt, I mean, I don't see much of it, to be honest. I mean, maybe I'm not talking to some of the silent majority of Jews that are squirming. They ought to be squirming. As Randa said, we ought to be making them uncomfortable, but I'm not seeing it at least in the press, the Jewish mainstream spokesman. On the contrary, they're cheerleading this horrible atrocity and genocide.
Peter, could you elaborate on what you meant by most Israelis are agnostic or atheist? Within Israel, is Jewish identity considered more of an ethnic than a religious identity? How does this feed into the development of an ultra-nationalist ideology? I
mean, look, Herzl was an atheist. So the founder of Zionism was not a religious Jew. And they use religion as a cover. But I don't have the data, the statistics, but most Jews I grew up with were not religious Jews. They were agnostic, I guess. Most Jews in Israel are secular agnostic Jews. You could find better data. I don't have the exact data. So it's not a religious movement in the sense of a commitment to the dogmas or the doctrines of Judaism. That's why I mentioned the so-called true Torah Jews that are the ones in the black hats that, you see in New York. It's an ethno-nationalist movement. Zionism is an ethnic supremacist movement. That's the only way to describe it. Now, the Judaism is a cover. It's got nothing to do with the religion. And in fact, as I keep saying, the ultra-Orthodox Jews, they're anti-Zionist because actually the Jews don't get to have the state of Israel until the Messiah comes back. That's their doctrine. And they say all the right things about Zionism. They say all the things you and I would say in criticism of Israel. They're out in the streets there. I'm a bit surprised. I don't fully understand why the Palestinian movement hasn't given more attention or embraced them, because they're the refutation of this anti-Semitism accusation. You've got 100,000 Jews in black hats in a baseball stadium in New York saying everything you and I would say. So you can't accuse them of being anti-Semitic. It's a joke. So yes, the question's a good one. If you travel in Israel, I mean, they go through the motions. It's a bit like, I don't know, Italy's Catholic, I mean, they have certain rules that the legislation observes certain things. You can't do certain things on the Sabbath. But we're talking about, I mean, the leading politicians, the founders, they weren't religious Jews. None of them.
In Israelism, the film that was released a couple of years ago, we can see how American Jewish children are indoctrinated in Zionism from a young age. Does this happen in Australia as well? I mean, given what you said about the two countries being quite different.
Look, it's hard to, again, give a statistical picture, but yes, kids go to Jewish school, they go to Sunday school. The Jewish community tends to be a fairly isolated, ghettoized community. Maybe younger people are less so today. The Jews I grew up with are still at dinner parties with each other. They married one another. I made, a terrible sin. I married out, as they call it. I married a Catholic, so, I was already, disqualified.
Living in sin.
Yeah. So, but certainly the Jewish engagement here, the education encourages kind of a commitment. There were the Zionist youth groups. I never went to them. Again, one of maybe the reasons I was somehow different, there was the Beitar and Habonim and these. I thought they were just holiday camps for young people, but they were Zionist. They were Zionist youth camps. And most of the people I grew up with, most of my friends went to those summer camps. And you get your head full of Zionist mythology. So I don't know the statistics exactly. I know a couple of young people that went through Moriah, and they're very heavily Zionist. I mean, these Jewish schools, they're very careful to maintain a kind of doctrinal purity. And so it's very hard to generalize. But as I say, the general picture I have is that Australia certainly is much more narrow and Zionist than perhaps even in America, although you've got differences. Over there, you've got APAC, which funds politicians. Here, AJAC doesn't quite to the same extent buy politicians. But the attitudes in the Jewish community generally, again, I'm looking at the Jewish press, and I don't know, again, statistically, how many of the Jewish community buy the line that you can read in the mainstream Jewish press, but it's pretty shocking.
How can Palestinian supporters in universities across Australia work together to fight against the Universities Australia IHRA definition, or this new version of the IHRA definition? Should we be working together with, through unions?
I mean, all of that. My friends who are active in the union, I'm, redundant now. I'm retired, so I'm no longer active in the union. But they've been very strong. I think the NTU have been very good. And yes, within the mechanisms that are available at the university, I don't know how to be more specific. They're doing good things. They're having rallies on campus. The students have been very good. Those students that ran the encampments and so on. And I think it's important to have forums and invite speakers. That's very important. Have anti-Zionist speakers and see the reaction you might get from the administration. They'll probably push back as they do around the world. There's been many, many cases where they've cancelled speakers like wonderful Francesca Albanese and various places. It's harder to get a strong anti-Zionist voice. But that's very important because then their point of view gets heard by students and other academic staff. So there are lots of opportunities available at universities to run seminars. There are courses that are being taught, although they're under scrutiny always. So all of those things. And there are the few Palestinian colleagues, but we need wider representation. It's not just, we should support not just the Palestinian colleagues, but others. Courses in history, for example. I once gave a lecture to a history class and was able to go back and look at the history of Zionism and so on. Students need to be exposed to that. And of course, that raises the question where students, express it's not a safe space. I mean, I had to deal with this. I could tell you it's relevant to your question about how to deal with this with students at the universities. I gave a course that it's not my area exactly, but I turned it into a political course. And in my very first lecture, I said to the students, anticipating, the rule, I said, this is not a safe space for ideas you don't like, for controversial ideas. And I had to say that. One student missed the first lecture, and in the next lecture, when I was saying some outrageous things, they complained to me that I was, saying terrible things. And I had to explain to them, yeah, that's what you're at university for. You shouldn't be protected from ideas that are controversial or that are uncomfortable or that are unwelcome. That's unfortunately the way universities are moving. And as a general answer to your question, we ought to resist this idea of making it a safe space, in this case, for anti-Zionist positions. I mean, we ought to be able to, just give the history, go back to, as you said, to the Balfour Declaration and to reading, the history and the documents.
I remember I spoke to Professor Sari Maqdisi as well, and we were talking about this campaign of intimidation, of silencing, or not allowing events to happen for pro-Palestine. And he was making the argument that, we should let them speak, but we also need to be reciprocated as well. If they let us speak and narrate our stories and our point and rhetoric, the situation will be very different. But the pro-Palestine community is faced with this kind of, intimidation and silencing. How do I best respond to the conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I mean, this has been debated in the social media a lot, and it looks like many of the Palestinian voices are the quickest to point the true anti-Semitism from the fake anti-Semitism. So how do we make the point and consolidate that difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism?
Look, it's pretty simple from what we've already said. Zionism is a political movement. It has a history. And if you know anything about the history or the current realization of it, these are factual questions. They're not controversial. So if you're talking about Zionism, you're talking about a political movement. And it's a racist, as I said, ethno-supremacist movement. This is the thing that you have to emphasize. That's what Zionism is. And you can look at any number of authoritative accounts of what Zionism is, the original founders of it, what we're talking about, the history of it. Okay, so it's not difficult to show that has nothing to do with anti-Semitism, because as you said rightly, if it was Buddhists or anybody else doing it, it's not about the religion. I mean, it can't be too difficult conceptually for people to separate out the religious affiliation of the people who are also running a political program, because the political program is perfectly clear. As I say, the history of it is so available. The trouble is, of course, as I said, movies and the mainstream culture sort of obscured the truth, as you know well, and the Palestinian side of the story has not been told at all or dishonestly. The difficulty is fighting back to explain what Zionism really is. And of course, you get people, these propagandists that are very vocal, and people like, Alan Dershowitz and various other people that are pushing a story. Okay, that's the debate. Whenever I give a talk, when I give talks, I often put up Alan Dershowitz's picture and Norman Finkelstein's. Okay, so people are entitled to try and figure out who's telling the truth, because they're both academics and, or Chomsky on one side. Okay, that's a fair question, but it's a matter of how well informed you are. And the distinction is clear. It's not that hard to understand the difference. Anti-Semitism should not be mixed up with political questions. It's a form of racism. That's all there is to it. And presumably some people are racist. I've got another point I might make. I've thought about this a lot. In a way, it doesn't matter if some people are racist. So let's say, hypothetically, some of the critics of Palestine and the Palestinian movement are racist. So what? On the one side, you've got maybe some racists, but on the other side, you've got people committing a genocide. I mean, so what? So I'm a self-hating Jew, and you're a genocider. What are you complaining about my psychology or my racial attitudes? It's obviously a scam. It's obviously an attempt to shut people up. And even if you are a racist, it's not an answer to somebody who's committing genocide. So in other words, it's kind of loses whichever way it goes. I mean, we're arguing and talking about how it's not well founded usually. The accusation is usually not appropriate. But even if it were appropriate, so someone's a racist and that motivates what they're saying, it doesn't mean what they're saying is false. If you're a racist and accusing Israel of crimes, it doesn't mean that Israel's not committing crimes. It's kind of a pretty simple, you don't have to be a philosopher, you don't have to be an academic to sort that out. That's why it's tragic that this thing seems to work on people. It's this ad hominem, we say. You accuse people of terrible motives. It's like in the Soviet Union. In the old days in the Soviet Union, they would say that if you criticized the Russian system, the Soviet or communism, you were a lunatic. You had to go to a lunatic asylum. It's like a crazy way of dealing with dissent. Dissent, it can't be dismissed by psychoanalyzing the person who's a dissenter. The question is whether what they're saying is true, whether what you're saying is true or not. That's not to do with what your motives are.
It's a distraction at best from the main goal, which is, targeting this genocidal state that is State of Israel. Unfortunately, it works on the heavily indoctrinated population, coupled, of course, with the extreme influence that those Zionist lobbies have in our political system.
Yeah.
So is it not up to mainstream Jews to decide what is anti-Semitism? Aren't efforts to refute anti-Semitism by others fundamentally disingenuous?
It's a good question. I mean, when the IHRA was being promoted, the Jewish communities, the Jewish lobbies that were pushing it, claimed, and they said it explicitly, that they had a right to define it. They somehow had an exclusive right to say what's anti-Semitism and what's not. I don't accept that at all. I mean, it's an objective question that has criteria. And the Jews, predictably, for their own reasons, and I think the Australian judge, Sackville, who wrote about it, and I think Jeffrey Robertson as well, Jews don't have a privileged position in defining this racism. They're the victims of it if it exists. But there's nothing that gives them any privileged status to tell everybody what it is, because they want to say that it's criticizing Israel, as we see in the IHRA. So it's an objective question that needs to be discussed, and one has to judge the claims on their merits. It's not a question of your credentials exactly as a Jew or non-Jew. I mean, I can decide whether in America there was anti-black racism, or here in Australia anti-Aboriginal racism. I don't have to be an Aboriginal to pay attention to that or to have a decisive view. I think that's a special pleading, which is obviously designed to silence critical voices. And I don't think we should take that seriously.
The thesis of the question is targeting, let the Jews, the majority of the Jews identify what that definition is. But when you incorporate the concept of Zionism in it, you take it out of that category.
And that's why, given that they think that some voices are more important than others, I mentioned the 200 experts on anti-Semitism, the JDA. If you want to listen to Jews, listen to them. It's very interesting that their opinion and their definition was downplayed. And I think that's been unfortunate.
The idea of so-called Jewish restoration to the Holy Land was a product of the Protestant Reformation. The original spark for the modern European Zionist colonial project. Why are the origins of the modern European Zionist colonial project never discussed? Also, with that in mind, are Christian Zionists part of the problem?
The restoration of Jews to the Holy Land is certainly part of the vision. The Jews claim that they have some rights there. By the way, I should say something about that. They have zero rights. I mean, the idea that I have rights that you don't have is such an appalling obscenity. The idea that people who have lived there for generations can be displaced or don't have as many rights as some European Jew, that's the idea of the return, which is legally enshrined in Israeli law, that I have more rights than you have, which is kind of an absurdity. That's the first thing about the return. But the idea that some 2,000-year-old history gives any rights to contemporary Jews, that's very widely held, actually. Jews very deeply believe they have some rights that they inherit. That doesn't make any sense. I make a joke about it. Do the Muslims have a right to Spain? I mean, it used to be Al-Andalus. It used to be an Islamic state. So all of the Muslims now have a right to come back to Spain? Or better still, Britain used to be Roman. So all the Italians can now claim that they can go back to Britain? It's like so crazy when you think about it. So why do Jews have some special claim that they have some historical rights? They have zero. Now, that's the first thing I want to say about that. The Christian Zionists, they buy into this. And they're a very powerful force in America. There may be more Christian Zionists than Jews in America. They're very influential in Parliament, in the Congress. That's a serious issue. I don't know what to do about that. I mean, I don't know how one fights there, because they've got these biblical stories about the end of times and the apocalypse, and some Jews will be saved and the rest will go to hell. Look, this is crazy, but that's politically very powerful in America. It's been driving a lot of, it's not just AIPAC and the Jewish lobby groups there. That's a problem in America, but maybe they could be sidelined if there's some political resolution that is approaching some justice for the Palestinians.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, many people actually forget that Zionism in the origin is actually not Jewish. It was a figment of the imagination of Christians, based on anti-Semitic sentiments, they're wanting to send the Jews away. I mean, I remember I've been reading Shlomo Sand's book, The Creation of the State of Israel, and he's actually saying the rabbis all the way back to the 17th century and the 16th century, even to contemplate the thought of returning to the Holy Land, according to the Talmud, is actually prohibited.
That's what they say.
Yeah.
That's right. The New York Jews think that you're not allowed to go back until the Messiah comes. Yeah.
Absolutely. But Zionism actually capitalized on the forgery of these understandings. So I do want to ask you one last question, Peter, and thanks for your generosity, for your time. We're seeing all these campaigns of silencing against Palestinians. We're seeing the smearing accusations. We're seeing activists being arrested, in Melbourne, Hash Day has been accused of, a charge of terrorism. We're seeing these new definitions and in academic spaces. Give us some thoughts and guidelines. How we do move forward in our pro-Palestine activism? What are the strategies that we need to follow?
Geez, that's a big question to ask me. I don't think I have a single one answer. Look, it's like other political movements. I mean, the best answer I can give is that I'm old enough to have been around during the Vietnam War, during the East Timor crisis, and I was involved especially in the East Timor crisis, in helping to push back. There are some important parallels. The grassroots movements, the Palestinian groups, APAN and others, and the Jewish groups. It's not clear what else we can do except what we're already doing, and try to spread the word as far as possible. It's frustrating because it's slow. I mean, the Vietnam War took years before it was reversed. But by the way, that was reversed because of domestic pressure at home in America. It became unpopular domestically, and it turned it around. It was very long and slow in coming, which is the sad part about these movements, that meanwhile, enormous tragedy for the victims. East Timor, too, there was an atrocity there, a near genocide in East Timor. But, it ended because of pressure, popular pressure, because the activists kept the issue alive. The Timor case is a very good example around the world, probably the South African case as well. So we should learn from that. I often give examples of, popular movements, you may know in Ireland, the Dunnes Store protest, which one checkout girl refused to process a grapefruit or something. And it's a long story, but that one act of resistance led to all of the workers going out. And finally, Ireland reacted against the South African apartheid, and Nelson Mandela came and congratulated them. So small acts can grow, and I think they're the best example we've got of what to do. Do what we're doing, but perhaps more of it. I should say also, because it's on my mind from the questions you've asked, I don't think we're making enough inroads into the Jewish community. I make whatever effort I can to go to the Jewish conferences. I was banned from the main Jewish conference, the Limud Oz, for talking about the boycott of BDS. But that becomes more important today than ever. It's almost become legally mandated now. I mean, that's becoming important. That's an important element in our struggle. And so I think we have to find ways of spreading out beyond the converted. I mean, it's very important. The rallies, I find them very inspiring and valuable for solidarity. I get a lot out of them. I mean, they're not weekly anymore, but they were very useful. But we're all talking to each other. The speeches are all powerful, but we need to try and find ways to spread the word out. The media are important. They're very resistant. I mean, the ABC is shocking. It's misrepresentation of this. That's the sort of area we need to make efforts where to spread our message more broadly. After all, in a way, it ought to be easy. We're the ones telling the truth. We have justice on our side. That's our strength. And the Zionists, by the way, that's what's explaining the Israel lobby people, the Zionists. They have to deal with, I said this in my speech, actually. Everybody's watching the horror on their phones and on their screens. And they can't get away with denying now what everybody sees for the horror. It's even the least pictures. I said in my speech, Gaza looks like Hiroshima. So now that's why they ramp up the anti-Semitism bullshit, because they can't deny the realities. They're so bad, they're so indecent, they will even say, look what we did in Japan to Hiroshima, as though that justifies what they're doing. It's quite extraordinary. So they can't deny what's going on there. And they recognize that they have to play dirty by trying other tricks with their anti-Semitism. It's not working. And so in that sense, we can gain strength from the fact that we just have to tell more about what's going on is clearly available to us with all the human rights organizations and so on. So more of what we're doing, I think, is the right answer.
Well said, well said. And you can see how the Zionist movement is actually panicking. We're seeing all these statements made by Mark Lieber in the social media. It's just it's an indication that we are actually making achievements and we are gaining tracts. And I think, as Ilan Pappy mentioned in his interview, that Zionism is definitely on the fall. We should be inspired by these words. On that note, I really want to thank you very much, Professor Peter. It's been an incredibly enjoyable conversation.
Thanks, Ahmed.
You've been listening to The Palestinian Show, Red Inverted Triangle. If you'd like to learn more about Palestine, or if you'd like to get involved in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, please follow Palestine Justice Movement Sydney on Instagram or Facebook. And keep tuning in to Red Inverted Triangle. My name is Ahmed. I will see you next time.